Chapter 11. They say the devil is a bald man with spectacles, but Smith thought of him as being a rosy-cheeked, with a prosperous moustache and a shrewd sense of a bargain when he saw one. In his first nights in Newgate, Smith dreamed many times of the devil and what terms he might get for his soul. He had long conversations with him in which the devil offered him escape, vengeance on the Mansfields, and enough money for himself, Mr. Billing, and the chimney sweep down the road, and all for a little future frying. "I like you, Smith," the devil murmured. "We're both men of the world, and I'm partial to you, particularly fried." Which prospect didn't seem as horrible as it might have done, for nights in the stone hall were that dismal and cold that the thought of any fire, even hell's, was agreeable. Also, these nights were unnaturally long and hard to sleep in. There were a continual mutterings and mumblings and sudden cryings out. There was the clinking of leg irons, which sounded, when it was regular, like an endless chain being winched into some deep pit, while from far off, from the part of the jail that was called the castle, where wealthy felons and prisoners of state paid high money for their lodging, came the faint sounds of singing and good cheer, as Dick Mulroon was swigged and swilled on his way to his end. On the 4th day of counting, my true love sent to me 4 sextons digging, 3 parsons praying, 2 horses drawing, and a felon in an elm tree. On which Smith's ancient fireplace companion would moan and wheeze and finally wake up with a "That's my boy," and jingle into a sitting position from which he'd watch Smith with deceiving bright eyes. Looking for the Newgate Star, he'd begin, for Smith usually laying with his eyes wide open and fixed on the ragged black hole above. Then the man would mumble and mutter about Smith's visitors and what they'd had to say. He missed nothing, and it seemed at times as if pecking up scraps of other folks' business was the only thing that kept him alive. Of all Smith's visitors, he was most inquisitive about Mr. Billing, whom he regarded as a real caution of a gent, and one to be handled with the tongs. Mr. Billing had come to see Smith each day, sometimes only for minutes, but at other times for an hour or more. Once he met Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny and exchanged the briefest of courtesies with them, then left almost directly, saying he'd be out of the place in family discussions. Miss Fanny was much impressed by him, and even Miss Bridget had to admire he was quite gentlemanly to the look, all of which gave Smith a certain gloomy pride, though he never admitted to more than legal business between himself and the visiting attorney, and so left his sisters most respectfully puzzled. But no matter whether Mr. Billing stayed long or short, he contrived to strengthen his acquaintance with Smith by unexpected touches of humour and warmth. He scarce ever referred to the document again, for it was as plain as a pike's staff there'd be no escape without it. Once or twice he spoke of Mr. Black, but it was only to say, thank goodness that evil man had not shown himself. Also, he begged Smith to be on his guard against such a visitor, though he doubted if Mr. Black would dare to show his face in Newgate. He hinted also of a departure from this place to pastures new, which was being thought of. Never fear was the only matter likewise in hand, to which Smith had nodded very gloomily indeed. This sadness of his had been carefully observed by the ancient eavesdropper who taxed Smith with it that night. "You ain't got it, have you?" he said triumphantly. "Got what?" "What he wants, so you'll have to stay." He looked pleased as Punch at the thought of Smith being his companion forever. "You mind your own business," muttered Smith savagely, and glared the old man's beam off his face. "Ain't got none to mind," and said the old man forlornly, and Smith relented somewhat and explained dismally, "If I stays, they'll nub me." But the old man seemed not to have heard him, for he stared vacantly into the air for several minutes, then slowly closed up his eyes and went to sleep, still sitting, and leaving Smith to worry himself into a state of sick desperation. His trial was already fixed, January 23rd, and the very day they were nubbing Dick Mulroon. Swing out the old, swing in the new, so to speak. Smith came to thinking his fate and Mr. Mulrone's were somehow linked, and if the highwayman perished, then he'd not be long after. 8 more days had Dick Mulrone. How many had Smith? The document! The cursed document! Furiously, he shut his eyes and tried to picture it, hoping his new skill in reading would reveal from his mind's eye what Mr. Billing wanted to know. But, alas, he could not make any more of it now than when he looked at it in the darkest ignorance. His mind's eye showed him nothing but a spidery jumble. Not having understood what he'd seen, he'd not known what to remember. He wondered if Miss Mansfield had come upon the document yet, and if it had meant anything to her. He sweated with terror at the thought of her giving it to the attorney for nothing. "Oh, gosh," whispered Smith, staring up at the blackness of the chimney as if for an answer. Why did the old gent have to stuff his pockets with such deadly papers? What right had he to go stumping through the streets, heavy with the devil's literature to tempt the likes of me with? He shook his head and groaned at the misery of his lot, and wondered if he'd be hanged without ever discovering what he was being hanged for. Smith's hopes were low. Only one held out any promise, Meg, the scullery maid from Vine Street, and then, at last, she came. She'd kept her word, even though a heavy fall of snow had begun during the night and was not yet done with. Her shawl and bonnet were grandly dappled with it, and her nose had been whipped by the wind to a strawberry. But she'd brought Smith some veal pie, sausage and white bread. Also, 2 white shirts he'd left behind. She'd have come earlier, but she'd been that afraid of having her heart broke, she dared not leave the kitchen. "You poor thing," she said, giving him the bundle. "Oh, you poor thing." She gazed at him sadly. "You've grown smaller and wizeneder. You needs feeding up, and, not meaning to be personal, dear, you needs another good wash." Smith shuddered at the memory and began to unwrap his bundle while Meg looked about her at the skinny, blotched and sadly cunning faces that haunted the stone hall. "Cleverness?" she sniffed. "Look where it gets you. I'll wager there's enough cleverness here to sink London Bridge. Brains? Give you a farthing for them." Then she settled down with a great commotion of her bonnet and shawl and began to talk the changes for the worse in Vine Street since Smith had gone. Mr. Mansfield, it seemed, hardly had a civil word for anybody, and the mistress was a regular demon, finding fault where there was none, which Meg considered was a demon's chief office. Even handsome Mr. Billing wasn't particularly welcome, for, try as he might to be cheerful of an evening, the talk always came back to Smith, and there was an end of all cheerfulness. Meg said this with some satisfaction, as if it ought to have been a real comfort to Smith to learn he was the cause of misery. But Smith nodded and smiled and bided his time. Then, at last, through all the byways of her conversation, Meg came back to "you poor thing," the sigh of someone who's been the long way round. Smith said, "They're going to hang me, Meg." You poor thing. "There's but one soul who can save me, Meg." "Ah, the master?" "No, Meg, you." Meg looked astonished, fidgeted with the fringe of her shawl, then slowly shook her head with an air of great sadness. "If heart can save you, child, then it's done. But this is a wicked world of cleverness. It's heart I need, Meg, for it's cleverness that what put me here." Meg nodded deeply. There was no less than the truth. "Say on, little one." So Smith bent close and began to mutter urgently and pleadingly to Meg's large, gentle ear. Did she recall the paper she'd found when he'd been washed? She nodded. Was it still where she put it? Most likely, for it had been deep in a drawer. Could she get at it? Most likely. Would she get at it for Smith? She opened her eyes in alarm. "Why, child, it's the master's." "No, it was mine, and it's the only thing that'll save me. I couldn't steal from the master, but it was mine. It's all a nasty piece of cleverness, child. You'd be best off without it. Believe Meg. Meg, you're a hanging me, true as we're here. If I don't get it, I'll be buried before the spring. Meg! Oh, little one. Oh, the frightened Meg had begun to cry with the sudden misery of her dilemma. Her heart and conscience were much at odds. More than ever, she hated cleverness and all it brought in its sly train. I don't know what to do. Oh, goodness. What would my mother say? As she rocked herself to and fro, the old man began to rock himself likewise, and then croaked amazingly like the parrot he so closely resembled. As she rocked herself to and fro, the old man began to rock himself likewise, and then croaked amazingly like the parrot he so closely resembled. Meg! Meg! Follow your heart, Meg! She looked startled, then stared with her wet eyes at the disreputable old man. She nodded. That's her voice, child, and them's her words. She often talks to me, now she's dead and gone, sometimes out of old men, sometimes out of mischievous urchins, and sometimes out of heaps of potato peelings. And it's always, follow your heart, Meg. So I'll fetch you the paper, little Smith, and may it save your poor neck from the shameful noose. Smith considered himself as good as out of the jail, and the change in him was as astonishing as it was abrupt. His spirits rose, and he put on a confident, almost patronizing air. He strutted importantly about the dismal stone hall, even finding opportunities to practice his reading upon the scratched messages, prayers, and rages that scarred the damp walls. God have mercy on me, he read out, and shrugged his shoulders. Next, he read Joe loves Bess. He scratched his head and wondered why anybody should want to write such a thing on a prison wall. Then God rot all lawyers. Huh, that was more like it. His high spirits were bewildering to his sisters who'd last seen him on the depths of gloom. Oh, smut, said Miss Fanny, to see you in such spirits is better than a pint of gin, dear. Now, no matter what befalls, we'll know you went happy. Oh, I'll be happy going, said Smith, enigmatically. And Miss Bridget stared at him sadly, as if he was a lost soul. But Mr. Billing understood. Maybe at first he wondered if Smith had the document already, for he'd arrived shortly after Meg had left. Not that it was really likely he'd seen her. There were such a stew in Newgate at that time, that with Mulrone's visitors in the bad weather. But he saw the bundle and smiled knowingly. Smith, seeing this look, divined its meaning. He shook his head and grinned. Not yet, Mr. Billing, but it won't be long before the chimney sweep down the road will be situated to buy himself new brooms and a whole new chimney for his very own. If you take my meaning, Mr. Billing. Mr. Billing took his meaning. And it won't be long before a certain little bird flies out of its stone cage, eh, lad? He beamed and laid his hand on Smith's thin shoulder. How much better is it to put our cards on the table, play fair and be friends? Oh, the world's not such a bad place after all, for the likes of you and me. This was on Sunday, January 15th, a day remembered, if for no reason than for the extraordinary violence and passion of its snowstorm. And it was as if the devil's cat had got among the angels and was scattering their feathers everywhere. There seemed no end to the snow.